Hey, what's up, y'all? Welcome to episode 2 of the Bad Eye Podcast. If you're joining us as a returning listener from last week, I just want to first off say thank you for listening. I truly wasn't expecting as much positive feedback as I got, and I'm so pleased that those of you who listened enjoyed what you heard, and I'm encouraged and excited to bring you more. If you're new to the podcast, welcome, get comfy. I'm your host, Andrew, although you may address me also by my proper titles the Great Khan of Contrarian Takes and Beef Patty Sommelier. I want to start off this week by wishing everyone a happy Black History Month. And may this podcast episode serve as a reminder to the non Black members of the audience that you haven't done a perfunctory, performative Instagram post about it yet. And as a further reminder that you actually just don't have to. Nobody actually likes those. As a further request that has been passed on to me by the Black delegation of the General Ancestral Congress of Dead People Who Cook with Seasoning, I'd also like to remind you all that you don't have to wish all the individual Black people you know a happy Black History Month like it's a real holiday. But if we are going to collectively make that a thing, I'd like for you all to, at the very least, petition the government that we get the month off work as reparations. I'm experimenting a bit with the format this week. I'm going to start off with a rundown of the news for the week, and then, in honor of Black History Month, we're going to talk about some Black Canadian stuff. Some serious, some fun, and then maybe sneaky serious again at the end. Before I start anything, I do want to say I know that there was some huge news about Palestine and Gaza specifically this week. I've chosen not to talk about it in this episode beyond what I'm about to say because there was no way for me to talk about it without it becoming the entire episode. I think it really deserves much more time than I'm able to give it this week, but I did want to mention it and one, say that it's even more unconscionable that people are now openly advocating for ethnic cleansing rather than just passively advocating for it the way that people have been doing up until now. And two, say that I am aware of it. I'm aware that it happened and reassure you again that I do plan to talk about it. I had other stuff planned that I wanted to talk about this week, and it felt wrong including it in the rundown before the meat of the episode when it deserves to be the focus of the episode. So, with that being said, before we get into the cool shit, let's talk about tariffs. As I'm sure most of you know, Donald Trump signed an executive order that went into effect February 1st that placed a 25% tariff on nearly all Canadian goods sold in the US, alongside a lower 10% tariff on Canadian energy, much to the bewilderment of basically everybody. Not only was it kind of unclear what the motivation behind the tariffs were, it was also unclear what Trump and his backers thought they stood to gain from this. The reason he gave was migrants and fentanyl crossing the border into America. And even though that's an obviously ridiculous thing for him to have been upset about, because as our prime minister pointed out, like 1% of the total fentanyl that enters the United States comes from Canada, and the number of illegal border crossings is also in that ballpark. It is a negligible percentage of the total people entering the US, quote unquote, illegally. It seems like there was some validity to him saying that, because on Monday, Trudeau was able to negotiate a temporary reprieve by agreeing to appoint a fentanyl czar, whatever the fuck that is, who, if they're anything like a real historical czar, will inevitably bankrupt his office, waging a bunch of pointless wars against an imaginary enemy and be deposed by like a chairman of the Council of Fentanyl Commissars or something. And also by wasting a bunch of federal money on a pointless task force to police the world's longest undefended border to address a problem that barely exists. And as a fun bonus, designating some Mexican cartels as foreign terrorist organizations. Now, I want to say pretty clearly that I think all of that is pretty dumb. Not because the opioid crisis isn't very serious and doesn't genuinely harm communities on both sides of the border, but because I don't think that any of the things proposed are going to address this crisis in a real or serious way. And I'm also kind of generally against the increased militarization and securitization of our border, both for political and personal reasons. I just don't think it's especially helpful or necessary given the scope of the issue in question. And I also just don't look forward to interacting with border security on a border that's more heavily policed in the event that I, for some reason, need to cross the border in the future. I think most people who have crossed the border before in their lives can agree that we don't want it to be even more unpleasant of an experience. But I also want to acknowledge that, in the grand scheme of things, calling this a victory for Trump is a stretch. And I think that people on his side of the border are struggling to spin it that way. The amount of money that's actually being spent here, while again, I think it's wasted, is nominal on the scale that our government normally spends on things that are a priority for it. It's also really an expansion on an initiative that was already announced in December. We basically just told him we were going to do what we were already going to do, and he caved immediately, which seems like a good sign. There is definitely a concern that this is a temporary reprieve and that he's going to demand something else in 30 days, but if this turns out to be the end of it, it will have been a relatively small price to pay. I do think more demands are coming, and we should be very careful about what we do and don't agree to. Trump trolling us about becoming the 51st state seems pretty ridiculous, but in the context of his other expansionist ambitions and the kinds of figures from American history he himself cites and claims to admire, I think it would be a mistake not to take him seriously. Well, okay, let me rephrase that. You should never take him seriously because he's an inherently ridiculous, unserious person. But it would be a mistake not to take him at his word that he wants that. And so, because of that, I also see this as an opportunity for Canada to really reassess its relationship with the United States and consider whether we really want to be so dependent on a neighbor that has proven themselves so unpredictable and so unreliable. It's true that we have a lot in common with them. We share a language. I would argue we share some culture, although we each have our own distinct flavor of it. And the realities of geography and the fact that both countries are so massive and that we have no other real neighbors does kind of mean that, for better or for worse, we're kind of stuck with them. But I think this incident, however it plays out, should be a real wake up call for us in a few ways. The first is that we are far too dependent on the US for trade, and a large part of that is for convenience's sake. It is objectively cheaper, more efficient, and to be fair, more environmentally sound to ship things over shorter distances. But I think that despite that, one lesson that we should learn here is that it is unwise to put all your eggs in one basket, especially when that basket withdraws from the World Health Organization and now all your eggs have bird flu. We are a resource rich country, and the United States is not the only country that needs those resources. It might be a little less profitable in the short term to sell to a diverse set of countries in Europe, Africa, South America, and Asia. It might require a little bit more interconnected global trade infrastructure that we don't currently have right now. But there's also less of a risk of our entire economy being cratered by one dickhead who himself doesn't seem to know what he was hoping to achieve from this. There's also something to be said for moving the world towards a multipolar world order, where there isn't one hegemon that has the power to lord its influence over everyone else. And the amount of trade that we as a country do with the United States makes us deeply invested in the US empire, in making and maintaining it as that hegemon. It is a good idea to be a good friend and ally to the hyper-militarized superpower on your border. But it's also a good idea to have some other friends, so that hyper-militarized superpower can't just decide you belong to it now. To put this in r/relationships terms, as a country, we are Canada 21F, and we moved in with the US 36M way too soon and signed a free trade agreement to stop hanging out with all our friends. And now he's going on Nazi benders and punching walls and shit. And we could really use a community of supportive parties to intervene in this situation before he kills our cat. The second thing is, I also think that now would be a good time for us to start thinking about how dependent we are on resource extraction. All of these resources are finite, and extracting them has real environmental impacts. Extracting minerals from the ground is an environmentally destructive process in and of itself. But in the case of oil and lumber, there are also secondary environmental impacts. The impact of refining and then burning that oil, and the loss of forests, which is, in addition to supporting whole ecosystems, also capture carbon from the atmosphere to help mitigate some of the effects of burning the oil in the first place. Now, look, with the exception of oil, I realize that some amount of resource extraction will always be necessary, even if we were to diversify our economy a little bit. I think that as a global community, we ought to be moving away from fossil fuels as much as possible. We have the technology to do that already in significant ways, and the reasons that we aren't are largely that it isn't in the interest of capital. But I recognize that in the case of lumber and minerals, the world does actually need those resources and will for the foreseeable future, and we are well positioned as a nation to provide them. I'll even concede that we have all this infrastructure set up already to produce oil, and that halting oil production immediately with no plan for how we're going to replace that economic activity and no alternative jobs for the people who currently work in that industry would have an extremely negative effect on the economy, and more importantly, a devastating effect on the livelihoods of thousands of workers. But I do think that we should be actively investing in alternatives and that our goal ultimately should be for everyone everywhere to be using alternative energy sources as much as possible. And by investing, I don't just mean funding companies to build solar farms and windmills. I mean investing in workers who currently have jobs in the oil industry to allow them to gain the skills necessary to work in other energy sectors if they want to. I mean investing in those sectors so that the jobs created are as well paying and as secure as the ones the workers currently have in the oil industry. I mean creating programs to give people a share of the profits from the sale of our natural resources, rather than allowing companies to plunder the places we live for resources, but not allowing the people whose shared inheritance those resources are a share in that prosperity. To say nothing of a real say in how and how much is extracted. But beyond that, we are also one of the most highly educated populations in the world. And for all that education, we don't produce all that much. Just to speak from the perspective of an industry that I know a little bit about, There is no local tech sector to speak of, at least not one that's doing any innovation or producing any new significant technologies, even when compared with smaller markets like Europe. I think a large part of that does have to do with how much talent we lose to the US because it's just so much larger of a market and salaries are so much higher. Although, to be fair, I think that maybe a lot of Canadians who have chosen to move south for those higher salaries may be reevaluating their options right now, given that they've got unelected Nazis doing soft coups in every government agency they have. They're using fucking 19-year-old brown shirts to collect everyone's social security numbers. But I also do think that another factor in why Canada isn't more productive or innovative in a lot of industries is that our own government doesn't do enough to drive the kind of productive industry that I'm talking about. Fund scientific research, fund innovation, fund education. There's no reason why we shouldn't have free higher education in this country. Many other countries, even poorer ones than this one, are able to accomplish that and it pays dividends for them. There is no downside to having a highly educated population. Although I do want to be clear, when I say fund innovation, I'm not talking about the kind of corporate welfare that they have in the United States, where giant tech corporations get massive government subsidies and effectively pay no taxes. There does need to be a give and take. Ultimately, I'm for dismantling a capitalist system and removing the profit motive altogether. We should be producing and innovating new technologies because they're useful and people need them. They would make people's lives better, not because somebody can make money off of them. That's the vision that I have for the future. But until we get there, I'll settle for the government incentivizing people to innovate in their fields, to produce new technologies, to be competitive in a global market. And I'm okay with the government doing that through subsidies as long as they're willing to hold those corporations to account when that investment pays off and it's tax time and the people writ large get to benefit from that investment. I don't want to go on for too long about the trade policy between Canada and the US because, frankly, I find it boring. But I did think it was important to talk about a little bit this week because I do think this is a real opportunity for us to reevaluate how our economy is structured and how we can put the interests of people above the interests of capital so that the people who actually live here have secure, well paying jobs, and also to reevaluate our role in the world. We can be more than Diet America. I believe we have that potential. We could be caffeine free America Zero, which, as everyone knows, is the best kind of Coke. Don't come for me. And we can also push the world towards a more multipolar world order by exercising our political independence from the United States more often and more consistently than we do, and by strengthening our alliances with other nations. We can use our highly educated workforce to become a leader in science and technology, to produce things in a way we haven't in a generation. If we invest in education and innovation and focus on creating our own stuff rather than being really good at using American stuff. There might be money in that niche, but there's no independence and there's no sovereignty. If we want to remain in control of our own political futures, we need to stand on our own 2 feet. We can't rely on America for everything. And that means producing more of our own shit. The last thing I'll say about the tariffs is really more about the reaction to the tariffs. I've never seen Canadians this united on anything. And there's a part of me that finds that to be a really good thing. You will never find me discouraging people from supporting local producers, farmers, craftsmen, and artisans. I think the heart of any coherent ideology that I pretend to have is community based. And I also think it's awesome that people are encouraging each other to buy local as much as possible. I was also just talking about deepening our alliances with other countries. And so I even think it's awesome that people are pointing out like Mexican goods and Asian goods and European goods in the grocery store and telling people to buy those over American goods. But I also want to say, and maybe I'm alone in this, maybe it's the Torontonian in me, because I do feel like this is maybe my most Torontonian take. I've often found that when I travel outside of Toronto in Canada, you do see a lot more Canadian flags just kind of hanging out and about in front of people's stores and houses and stuff in a way that's always made my urban brain kind of anxious. So, maybe bear that in mind as I say this, but I found the accompanying kind of groundswell of nationalism and patriotism that has come from the response to these tariffs kind of, let's say, unsettling. I'm really curious to hear where you guys stand on this because maybe this is just my nature, just not being super inclined to patriotism of any kind. But personally, like, my favorite part about being Canadian has always been that we don't do that here. Like, you don't see the kind of jingoism and chest beating that we often see from other countries, particularly Americans. Listen, I love my community, and I'm proud to be from where I'm from. But there's something about the kind of flag waving impulse that people have that I just find disquieting. It makes me anxious. It genuinely puts me on edge. When people say things like, this is the greatest country on earth, it frankly conjures images of like racist right wing mobs for me. And look, if you've been indulging yourself in displays of patriotism and nationalism and you know me personally, please don't feel like you've made me think you're a secret fascist. I understand that this rhetoric appeals to people who otherwise agree with me on most things. I don't think this is just a thing that racist right wing nut jobs do. But for my part, I've always found it kind of silly when people go around saying that the place where they live is the greatest country in the world. I just don't accept the premise for a bunch of reasons, some more theoretical and some practical. The most basic one is that it just doesn't make sense to me. There are good things and bad things about every country. There are things that some countries do better than this one, and there are some things that this country does better than anywhere else. Like I was saying in the last episode, societies are made up of people. And to expand on that idea a little, I think they're also reflections of us. People are flawed, and so societies are flawed. And saying that yours is the best anywhere is like saying you are better than everyone else. I think it's fine, even good, to celebrate the things that you love about the place that you live. But to say categorically that it's just the best community out there sounds too much like supremacy for my personal comfort. Which brings me to my second reason, which is that when people say that, this is the greatest country in the world, they're not just talking about their community. They're talking about the state where they live. And to say that about this state, with the history that it has, with all the flaws that it has, with all of the violence and supremacy that it has upheld and continues to uphold, makes me personally really uncomfortable as someone who was born here and who has connections to the communities that bore the brunt of that supremacy and violence, and who have seen the flaws of this state firsthand. There are parts of this country and society that I really do enjoy. I don't want to make it seem like I hate this place. For those of you listening who may not know me personally, I'm a mixed race person. My mom is Afro Caribbean and my dad is Middle Eastern. I'm a person that, by my very identity, could not exist many places. There are few societies on Earth where that combination of people interacts with each other with enough frequency that two of them could make a baby. That's something that's only really likely to happen in a handful of places in the world, and this happens to be one of those places. And I do love it for that. But a thing that has always frustrated me about Canada and about Canadians is our tendency to emphasize the legitimately great things about our society to the complete exclusion of the very dark parts of our history. And to an extent, that's something that every nation engages in. The kind of myth making of nationalism is not a thing that's unique to Canada. Every country emphasizes the good parts of its history over the bad. But I would argue that few are as brazen and as smug about it as we are. And as an example of what I'm talking about, and in honor of Black History Month, I'm going to talk a little bit about Black history in Canada. And in particular, the way that we have historically talked about and taught Black history in Canada. Now, I want to say before I get into this that I've been out of school for a while now, and I'm writing this in a post 2020 racial reckoning world. Like, we renamed Aunt Jemima, and, we put the black squares up, and racism is over now. We fixed it. We did it. We elected Justin Trudeau. He's our first blackface prime minister. And then, we all packed our things and went home because the work was done. So, despite the way that I just described that, I do want to acknowledge that it's possible that things may look different for kids that are in school today. I genuinely don't know what they're being taught about race or racism or the history of Black people in Canada. It might be different, it might not be. But for people of my generation, millennials and older Gen Z, people who were educated in the 90s through the 2010s, and certainly for people older than that, the way that most Canadians of those generations and older talk about the history of Black people in Canada is directly and inextricably linked to slavery in the United States. What I was taught in school about Black history started with slavery in America, the Underground Railroad. We talked about segregation in America, Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks, but like not the real capitalism and imperialism or bad Martin Luther King, the color of our skin, content of our character, Martin Luther King. The one Republican politicians love to quote. And it usually ended with apartheid South Africa and Nelson Mandela. And look, I'm not saying any of those are not important chapters in Black history, but you'll notice that only one of those chapters, the Underground Railroad, has anything to do with Canada. In my school, at least, we went on at length about the bravery of the Underground Railroad and what Canadians risked, sometimes at great personal cost, to do the right thing. About how we were more evolved than the Americans, who were still indulging in this backwards and barbaric system of slavery. If you know Canadians at all, you'll recognize this smugness. It's the same way we talk about America in every other context. Like we're just a little bit more enlightened than them. We have universal healthcare unless you have eyes and teeth. We have some gun control. We're not plagued by mass shootings in the same way they are. We didn't enslave people. We didn't have Jim Crow. Nobody was whipping people to pick cotton like they were in America. Except, let me let you in on a little something about the Underground Railroad. Something that I never thought to ask when I was in school learning about it. The Underground Railroad was active from 1834 to around 1863, which corresponds roughly to the time when slavery was abolished in the British Empire but still legal in the United States. You'll notice that that's a period of about 30 years. What we as Canadians stay real quiet about, especially when Americans are talking about slavery, is that for the preceding 200 years, we had full fucking legal slavery here too. We talk about slavery in this country like the reason there were no giant plantations with white overseers on horses whipping dozens and dozens of enslaved Africans picking cotton or sugar or some other cash crop was because the European population here was already at the time more civilized, more evolved, more genteel than the American counterparts down south. Whether or not we want to admit it, that's the narrative. It has always been the narrative. They're our friends, they're our neighbors. We love them in like a love thy neighbor sort of way, but we are a more evolved sort. When the reality is that the European population here was just as viciously racist and barbaric as the Americans were. And the reasons that those plantations didn't exist wasn't inherent Canadian kindness in their hearts. It was because the soil wasn't better and the winters were too long. We couldn't grow cash crops in the colonies that would later become Canada. So there was no need to import Africans en masse. But they did import and enslave African people here, albeit in much smaller numbers than they did in the US. And they enslaved indigenous people as well. I'm not going to talk at length about this country's treatment of indigenous people in this episode because it deserves its own episode. But I do want to acknowledge that it happened because you cannot talk about slavery in Canada and not mention them. It's just not historical. And they, both the indigenous people and the Africans, were treated every bit as brutally, subject to the same indignities, the same violence, sexual and otherwise, the same banal racism as they were south of the border. There is no way in which Canadians were better on this issue morally than Americans were. There were Canadian abolitionists, like there were American ones. And there were also Canadians who protested when the British imposed the end of slavery throughout their empire, which, by the way, was a direct response to a series of slave revolts that happened in the Caribbean that made the entire institution economically untenable. It wasn't out of the goodness of their hearts either. I'm not letting the British people off the hook here, because they too love to take credit for not being the very last nation participating in a system that should never have existed in the first place. Because a British right-winger being like, "But good sir, the British Empire ended slavery. We deserve recognition for that," is like a British serial killer being like, "Well listen, my son America killed like 30 people and he got away with it. And I only did like 25 murders, so really, in a way, aren't I more compassionate for having stopped before I really had to? I feel like I deserve a medal or something, some recognition at least." As if we were all meant to go, "Oh, sir, you're right. I'm so sorry. I hadn't realized. You're right, like I hadn't thought of the fact that you actually could have enslaved even more people for even longer. Is there anything we can do to make it up to you somehow? Would you like a cookie, sir, or a gold medal? Maybe a blowjob? Whatever you need, sir. We are at your disposal. You deserve recognition for this." But back to Canada. We never talk about the actual history of black people in this country outside of the 30-year period where we were slightly more humane in our treatment of them than Americans were. We don't even talk about what happened to the people at the end of the Underground Railroad. Where did they go? What were their lives like? Where are they today? My school never mentioned any of that, and I know from conversations with most of the people in my life that most schools never mentioned any of that. They never talk about Afro-Canadian communities in the Maritimes, about the discrimination they faced, about Africville, about the movement for civil rights in Canada that those people led. I grew up a black Canadian in Toronto, and if it weren't for an uncle that I have who lives in the Maritimes, I would have thought all black Canadians were the children of immigrants from the Caribbean or Africa. Even today, I don't know them. I don't know their culture. There are no Americans who know nothing about African American culture. There are many who don't know it as well as they should. There are many who don't recognize the contributions that black people have made to American culture. But there is no aspect of American culture and life that isn't touched by black Americans in some way. And I would guess that there are no Americans anywhere that couldn't name you a single famous African American. If you're Canadian and you're listening right now, I want you to think about a famous black Canadian who's from the Afro Canadian community, who's not a child of immigrants from the Caribbean or Africa, and who's not Viola Desmond, because they put her on the money and that's cheating. I want you to think about it and see if you can name me a single one. And if you learn their name after 2020, it doesn't count. I would guess that most of you are struggling right now. Even I failed this test. We have not historically taught the history of black people in this country at all. I never learned about Marie-Joseph Angélique in school, the enslaved woman tortured, hanged, and then burned for arson by another enslaved person forced to do so on pain of death himself, in front of a crowd of cheering people in Montreal in 1734. I never learned about Chloe Cooley, who was bound, beaten, and forced into a boat by the man that owned her and two of his friends to be sold in the United States because he feared that he would be forced by the state to free her, and whose bravery inspired another black Canadian, Peter Martin, who witnessed her struggling against these men to petition the government of Upper Canada to outlaw slavery, which ultimately led to the passage of the Act Against Slavery of 1793, which prevented the importing of slaves into Upper Canada, what is now Ontario, and would have led to the emancipation of all slaves in the territory within a generation had the institution not been outlawed throughout the empire before that. She now has her own heritage minute, which is kind of awesome. You can look it up if you want. But the fact remains, I was never taught any of that in school. Nobody I know, public education or private, was taught any of that in school. And even what we were taught in school about racism in America, the Underground Railroad, and apartheid in South Africa was not taught in a particularly effective or sensitive way. Growing up, I had the kind of cliched, complicated relationship with my own blackness that many light skinned biracial people have. I'm not original in that way. If both of your parents are black or you have darker skin, like, yeah, I was one of those, am I black enough to say nigga biracial people? I'm sorry. I was definitely annoying. I'm not going to sit here and deny that. There's not much I can do about it now, but I own it at least. I'm not going to sit here and pretend like I was not corny as fuck. What cleared it up for me, though, unambiguously, was a moment in the sixth grade when we as a class were reading a book called Underground to Canada by Barbara Smucker, the book they were using to teach about racism in the Underground Railroad, which incidentally was written in 1977 by a white Mennonite lady from Kansas who had only ever lived in Canada for 9 years when the book was published. When reading from the book, my white teacher, with no warning, dropped a full hard R N word, which, to be fair, like, it was in the text. I'm not expecting him not to read it, but, some warning would have been nice. And a whole bunch of white kids instinctively turned and looked at me like I was supposed to do something about it. If I wasn't sure I was a nigga before, I knew that day. But that's not even really why I brought it up. I brought it up because there was no support for me in that situation. Even my white peers felt uncomfortable, enough that they were looking at me like, are you going to do something about this? But what could I have done? Nobody in that situation, not the teacher, not the other students, and certainly not me, had the vocabulary, the sensitivity, or the knowledge to have that conversation the way it needed to be had. My school, every Black History Month, brought in a white South African to do an hour-long talk about apartheid. He would go on at length about the injustice of it and the bravery of the people who fought against it, particularly his white parents. And then he would teach us the gumboot dance, which, as he explained it, was taught to me by my parents, and they learned it when they were in the mines with the blacks learning to fight the apartheid, because my parents were also in the mines with the blacks. Did I mention the mines with the blacks? I did mention them. Have I said blacks enough times? Would you like me to say blacks a few more times? Would that make it more comfortable for you? Are you comfortable now? Have I really hammered the point about the blacks? Are we comfortable now? No? We're uncomfortable. Blacks. My favorite part about this was every year he brought a black guy with him. Every single year, whose job was just to sit behind him, play the djembe, and make the Africa face. You know the face I'm talking about. Every year, my man would be like, this is Kareem, my djembe fola. For those of you who don't know, that's an African word that means person who plays the djembe. I'm not going to explain why I brought a black guy just to sit behind me to play the djembe when the djembe is a drum from Mali and I'm teaching you a dance from South Africa. But everyone say hi to Kareem. And every year, I would silently make eye contact with the other 6 black kids at the school I went to, and telepathically, we would all be like, this is fucked up, right? Like, I'm a child and I don't know anything about anything, but I know this is fucked up. I feel like Kareem should at least get to introduce himself. I saw this presentation probably 5 or 6 times, and just once I would have liked to hear from Kareem. This is just a guess, but I bet he had more interesting things to say about racism than Blix in the Mines guy. Now, look, those are anecdotes. They're from my own life, but I am far from the only black Canadian with experiences like that. This country has a real problem with the way that it talks about race in general, and in particular, the way that it talks about its own racial history. As Canadians, we ought to be more honest about what this country actually is, what its history actually is, and the ways in which that history still impacts people today. Like I said earlier in the episode, choosing to emphasize the good over the bad is something that every country does to one extent or another. But we as a people are engaged in a profound collective denial about the real negative aspects of our society in a way that manifests itself in almost every facet of our national identity. This same impulse is what allows us to allow Americans to pretend that we are some sort of post racial liberal utopia. It's why we don't push back at all when liberal Americans joke about moving to Canada in the wake of every Republican electoral victory. We are in collective denial and engaged in collective gaslighting about what this country actually is and what its history actually is. And we define ourselves by that narrative instead of taking a real honest look at ourselves and who we are as a society. Because there are great things about this place, there are things to celebrate. And there are even ways in which we're not wrong about all the things Americans seem to admire us for. But there's also tons of room for improvement. And another thing that that narrative and that gaslighting does is give us permission to act as if the work is already done. We're already better, so why try and be better? America is the bar, and we are sailing comfortably over it. And the reality is that in some ways we are. Our healthcare system is better. We don't have random slaughter by aggrieved children or disgruntled men because we have restricted access to the means by which that slaughter is carried out in America. But in some ways we aren't. Even with all this anti-woke, anti-DEI reactionary bullshit, the American conversation about race is years, if not decades ahead of ours. And some of us are already echoing that reactionary sentiment when we haven't even got to the part of the conversation that the Americans are reacting to. And more than that, America shouldn't be the bar. Defining ourselves by a nation we already all think we're better than is not only insulting to Americans and a denial of the very real efforts of millions of them to make the country they live in a better place, it also lets us off the hook for ever making any attempt to improve ours. As long as we're a little bit better than them, we're doing fine. And the worse they get, the worse we have permission to get. We should be setting our own standards based on our own morality and the kind of society that we actually want to live in, and defining ourselves based on that. Leave Americans alone. Let them solve their own problems. And let's do the actual work to solve our own. Now, look, I promised at the top of the episode that we get into some fun stuff. So, on the topic of Black Canadians, and because somehow literally everyone in my life has wanted me to talk about this for the last 6 months, let's talk about Drake versus Kendrick Lamar. I want to say before I start, in 2025, I'm not personally a huge fan of either of these artists. I've enjoyed some of Drake's music in the past, but I genuinely have not listened to a Drake song since probably 2018. And I am a Kendrick fan, but my favorite work of his to this day is Good Kid, Mad City. Nothing either of these two men have released in the last 5 years is a part of my regular rotation of music in 2025. So, with that caveat out of the way, let's get into it. If you know me personally, you're not Canadian, or you are, but you're not Torontonian, you might be surprised to hear me readily admit that Kendrick absolutely bodied Drake in this beef. I feel like people are expecting me to come out really hard in defense of Drake. Not only am I a black Torontonian, but I'm also what you might call a Drake type black person. I'm a bald, light skinned, biracial man with a beard. But even if I wanted to defend Drake, I couldn't because I have never seen someone lose a rap beef that badly. Like, he took so many L's in this beef, it just became a series of Spanish Y's. If an Argentinian read the score of this beef, they would just pronounce it shh. That one had layers. I bet you didn't think you were here for Argentinian Spanish jokes, but here we are. If you didn't get that, you should Google it. It was a dumb joke, but I'm very proud of it. I'm not going to go into the minutia of every single track. That's not the type of podcast this is, and other people have already done a much better job than I ever could of dissecting every single line of every one of those songs to death. But I think it was clear to everyone the night Not Like Us dropped that Drake was cooked. No matter what he put out, it was not going to be good enough to compete with a song that called him a pedophile using a musical pun that was also one of the catchiest songs of all time. Even if Drake were as good of a rapper as he thinks he is, he was never getting over that mountain. It was just not going to happen. And I'm not sure why anyone thought that it would. And in typical Drake fashion, instead of responding with another song that just wasn't as good, when he knew he was beat musically, he proved that he fundamentally misunderstood the situation by trying to win this beef with lawsuits, unwittingly proving Kendrick right that he doesn't understand them and he doesn't understand the culture. But this isn't new for Drake. I don't know if people remember Drake's last big beef, the one with Pusha T. I feel like that one kind of quietly faded away, even though I feel like Drake got bodied even worse in that beef than he did in this one. The cover of the story of Adidon, the picture of a smiling Drake in blackface, is so burned into my memory that I don't even remember the tune of that song. Pusha didn't even need to release the song to win the beef. He just needed to show everyone that picture. "You are hiding a child" was one of the most brutal things anyone had said in a rap beef in decades. Drake was coming off his only real victory in any rap beef, his kind of quasi humiliation of Meek Mill, that he really only won because society at the time was so misogynistic that we all laughed at Meek Mill because Drake pointed out that his girlfriend was more famous than him. Listen, is that a world tour or your girl's tour is a bar? I'll give him that. But it does have the same energy as people that go, "This nigga loves his wife." Ha! Gee! If we're being honest, Drake won that beef because neither Drake nor Meek was really as committed to it as people who are really about that life are committed to it. When Pusha dropped the story of Adidon and Infrared, I remember people saying he had gone too far, that it was too brutal. And even at the time, I remember being like, do you guys even listen to hip hop? Gone too far? Jay-Z said on a song that he left condoms on Nas's baby seat. Gucci Mane bragged on a track about the murder of Jeezy's friend. Tupac and Biggie's beef allegedly got them both killed. What Push said was honestly light work compared to some of what has been said in beefs in the past, and Drake was totally unprepared to respond to it. And just like he did with Kendrick, when Drake couldn't win with bars, he tried to win with tricks. In November of 2018, on Pusha T's Daytona tour, Drake bought a bunch of tickets to Pusha's show. I know that because I was at that show. It was a sold out show. You couldn't get tickets anywhere. But I was in the room, and the venue was only a little over half full. I've been to shows there before. I know how many people the room holds, and it was nowhere near capacity. During the show, some people who may or may not have been paid by Drake booed and threw beer at Pusha T. What these people, and by extension Drake himself, fail to understand or take into account is that Pusha T is really about that life. He and his security beat the fuck out of those people. There was blood everywhere, and at least one person got stabbed. And then Push left the stage for like 5 minutes, came back out, and played Infrared to a room full of fans singing along, standing in a pool of this guy's blood. Drake would never. The show was cut short right after that, when every single police officer in Toronto showed up at the Danforth Music Hall. Which, incidentally, is interesting because I was a metal fan in high school and I have seen more than twice that amount of blood at that venue, and not a single cop was called, but that's a story for another day. My point here is that Drake has always fundamentally misunderstood what rap beefs are and how seriously rappers who are actual rappers take them. That's why he was so totally unprepared to battle both Kendrick and Pusha, and why his only rebuttals to anything they said were, "Well, I'm rich and everyone loves me." It was never about money or success. It was about reputation. One of the things that I found so ironic as a Black Canadian about Not Like Us was that, in a real sense, as a Black Canadian, Drake is not like us. Drake is the only Black person from Toronto that is not either African or Caribbean. He's not even Afro-Canadian. His dad is from Memphis, which makes it kind of tragic that he was so justifiably called out by Kendrick for misunderstanding African American culture and hip hop culture in particular. Because he also doesn't really get our shit. His fake patois is mediocre at best. I'm not even Jamaican, and I know that some of the expressions that he uses in his songs are things that Jamaicans would never say. And in America, he gets away with that because Toronto slang is heavily influenced by Jamaican slang in much the same way that London slang is. But even as someone who is West Indian and grew up in Toronto, a lot of the ways that he uses that slang in his music just never rang true to me. The accents that he puts on, both the fake Caribbean one and the fake African American one, if we're being real, because he definitely does not actually talk like that. The personas he affects, his whole shtick, it fooled Americans because they don't really know what we're like. And it fooled Canadians because a lot of them don't really know what we're like either. And because as a culture, we are preoccupied with being accepted by Americans. Almost all of the most famous Canadians, especially in entertainment, made it big by being accepted in America. And Drake was the first big rapper from Canada to really do that. We got lost in the sauce a little bit. Like, we got high on our own supply. It was cool to have a rapper that was accepted in America as a mainstream rapper. We've had famous Canadian rappers within Canada before, but Drake was really the first one with international appeal. Nobody called it the Six before Drake. I had never heard that term before in my life. This man gave us a crumb of popularity and we let him rename the whole fucking city. I'm still kind of mad about that, to be honest. But look, maybe that constructed persona is really the most authentic thing about him. Maybe that's his truest self. He's not like us, and he's not like them, but he has to have an identity. So he took some bits from us, he took some bits from them, and he made one up. As someone who's mixed myself, I get that. I'm a little sympathetic to it. But I also want to acknowledge that, like, all the criticisms of Drake, except maybe that he's an actual pedophile, because that's a thing that we just don't know, but all the other criticisms are valid. And I also want to say, like, he's definitely been in some situations that I would say are questionable with girls who are underage. But pedophilia is a very serious accusation, and I'm perfectly comfortable labeling him kind of a creep and a little weird and inappropriate with women of all ages. But I feel like if we're going to say someone is an actual pedophile, there should be at least a documented specific allegation, and I personally haven't heard one. But, besides that, all of the things that are said about him, all the criticism that gets levied at him about, never speaking about black issues in his entire career, that is valid. He has never spoken about any black issues in his entire career in a way that makes it seem like he's almost purposefully avoiding talking about them. I think it's one of the things that makes him so many racist white boys' favorite rapper. He's a safe, commodified version of a genre of music that has tremendous appeal to everybody, but completely divorced from any analysis of race and class that might cause them to have to reflect on their own positionality with respect to the people creating the music they enjoy. Every Drake song that's actually about anything is about like this sense of masculine grievance, about being a man who is worthy of respect and recognition, but not getting the respect and recognition that he deserves. Sometimes that disrespect is coming from women. Sometimes it's coming from the community of hip hop writ large, but it's always about his grievance and how aggrieved he is to not be getting the respect he feels like he deserved. I have never known an artist with so many songs about reluctantly getting pussy. My man has made the humble brag into an art form, into an entire subgenre of hip hop. And I don't think he intends for that to be the rallying cry for porn sick beta male fascists that it has become. But on the other hand, he's been hanging out with Aiden Ross, so maybe I am giving him too much credit and he knows exactly what he's doing. I guarantee you at least one of the 19-year-olds on Elon Musk's crack team of Nazi Boy Scouts is a massive Drake fan. I would put actual money on it. At this point, he makes music for guys that will send you the crying face emoji in the text where they tell you they leaked your nudes. That is the energy he brings to the industry in 2025. And now for the sneaky serious part. There's a reason my friends have been waiting 6 months for me to talk about this. And it's that I really, really did not want to talk about this. I didn't even listen to any of the diss tracks on either side when they were released. And I only listened to them now so that I could know what the fuck I was talking about to make this segment. This entire beef, and in particular the discourse around it, was just so personally unpleasant for me. And the reason for that is that, although as I hope should be clear to you by now, I am not a Drake fan. I feel no real kinship with him. But Drake is my media representation. There was no cultural script before Drake for Middle Eastern looking biracial guys being cool or desirable to women. That just wasn't a thing, and he made it a thing. I have to live with the fact that I know for sure that there are times in my life that I got laid because Drake was a thing, that I benefited from the cultural clout that he brought to people who look like me. And I'm not saying that to tell you I feel like I owe him anything. We physically resemble each other in the most superficial way. Like, I actually don't look like him at all, but we are the same type of person, the way that like Daniel Radcliffe and Elijah Wood do not resemble each other, but they are the same type of white guy. But my point here isn't that I feel represented by him, and so I was upset by how people turned on him. As I just detailed, I think all of the criticisms leveled at him were valid. My issue was with the discourse surrounding it, with the jokes, with the memes, and with who was participating and how they were participating. Because here's the thing. There are many valid criticisms to be made of Drake that have nothing to do with his identity. And there are even ways to be critical of the way that he uses and weaponizes his identity for clout. I think I've done a fairly good job of doing both in this segment. And I even think Kendrick handled that criticism with as much nuance as he could in the context of a series of diss tracks and a rap beef. But here's the thing. We don't want to hear you say nigga no more is a valid criticism coming from an African American rapper in the context of calling out a fellow black man for being objectively silent on every black issue and commodifying his culture for clout and wealth to a mostly white audience. It hits very differently when it's being shouted at you by a Filipino kid from Brampton at the club, or pops up at you on your timeline in a meme shared by a white kid from New Jersey. The problem I have with this beef is the same problem I had with the last beef. There is no way to have a conversation in rap beef about Drake's racial identity without inviting everyone who wants to be a part of that beef in on that conversation. And as a person who shares Drake's racial identity, some of y'all got real fucking comfortable. I will take whatever criticism you want to give from a black person within the black community, and I will consider it carefully. Because I understand my privilege as a mixed person, as a light-skinned person, and I understand that there are things that people who have two black parents, people who have darker skin, people who have less ambiguous features than mine will deal with that I just don't and will never have to deal with. You will never catch me out here denying that fact. You will never catch me out here backbiting or bad-eyeing anyone from within my community with criticism about the way that Drake, or even me personally, is using our identity. I might disagree, but I will never dismiss it out of hand. I am not upset about this because I feel like the criticisms that Kendrick made of Drake applied to me personally. But I will be damned before I validate some fucking Indian kid with a lined up beard that's so sharp it looks painted on posting memes about how it's over for light-skinned people. You don't get to be a part of that conversation. That is between us. And your favorite artist winning a rap beef does not entitle you to participate in a conversation about what is and is not acceptable for any black person to do. And this is a problem that goes beyond Kendrick Lamar and Drake. This is a problem with hip hop as a whole. And the underlying issue is, you guessed it, capitalism. Hip hop as a genre of music was created to talk about black issues, to give black people a means of expression that would allow us to talk about our experiences in a more candid way than previous forms of black art had allowed us to do. And it did that very successfully for decades. It still does that. But as hip hop became more popular and as it became more mainstream, two things happened. One is that capital got involved. The traditional power brokers of the American music industry saw the commercial potential of hip hop and began to offer lucrative deals to rappers. These deals gave them control over what was and wasn't acceptable within the parameters of the genre. And throughout the 90s and 2000s, as the commercial viability of rap music went up, the political content and social commentary became less explicit. You could still find it if you went looking for it, but it was almost relegated to a subgenre, what we call quote unquote conscious rap, which came with its own soft stigma, stereotypes, and the niche nature of which allowed it to be dismissed both by the broader black community, but also more importantly by society at large, in favor of less political, much more commercially successful rap. The second thing that happened as a result of that was that the primary audience for hip hop music stopped being black people. If capital is involved, the goal of art is going to be to reach the largest audience possible. And the largest audience possible in America and in the West is white. These two factors are both the source of this beef and the source of my frustration about the discourse. Kendrick sees himself as the heir to the true legacy of hip hop, the radical black tradition that evolved into quote unquote conscious rap. And he took offense at Drake making the comparison between the two of them because Drake represents the other, more commercialized parts of hip hop that marginalize artists like Kendrick in the first place in order to appeal to a broader white audience. But what I think both of these men failed to understand is that, conscious or not, rap no longer belongs to us. Capitalism made sure of that. And conversations about black identity, about black issues that happen through rap music are impossible to gatekeep and keep within our community in a world where most of the fans of both of these men are not black. You cannot have a conversation about Drake's identity as Kendrick Lamar, one of the most famous rappers in the world, without opening that conversation up to all of your fans, most of whom are not black and do not belong in that conversation. And inviting them all into that conversation through song was irresponsible because not all of them are equipped with the knowledge or even have a desire to have that conversation with any kind of nuance. There is no radical tradition in a hip hop industry that is as commercialized as ours is. Not Drake, not Kendrick, not any commercially successful artist. Both of them are selling a black experience to white people. The only difference is the packaging. The pylon that people participated in about Drake caught a lot of people like me in the crossfire because it gave permission to people who never should have been allowed into this conversation to talk shit about my identity and couch it in popular criticism of Drake. That made it really hard to enjoy because many of the jokes and the memes were not about Drake. They were about all the people who are like Drake, and that included me. And so if you enjoyed this beef, if you participated in it and the memes and the jokes, and you're not black, which I know most of you aren't, I want you to sit with that and think about who that came at the expense of. Because that was not fun for me, and it should have been. It wasn't a good time. I know a lot of you meant well. Most of you probably didn't think it was that deep, and maybe it's not. Some of you are going to hear this, and despite everything that I just said, make it about me being a butthurt light skinned person who was personally offended by Kendrick saying he doesn't want Drake to say nigga no more because I misunderstood what he meant, and I feel like it also applies to me. And if you are that person, like, you didn't really listen to anything I said, but there's also nothing that I can do to convince you that that's not the case. I would just like you to consider why you felt like you were entitled to an opinion about this at all. Because if you're not black, you aren't. I'm going to leave you with another poem this week. I wasn't planning on doing two poems in a row, but as I was writing this and thinking about the experience of talking about this rap beef with people, one of my favorite poems kept coming to mind. It's a poem by Maya Angelou called The Mask, and I hope that I do her version justice. I would encourage you, if you like the poem, despite the way that I'm about to butcher it, that you go and look up her performing it. I couldn't include it here for licensing reasons, and also because I think that poetry is a living thing that should be performed, but I know that I'm not going to do it as well as she did it. So I would really encourage you to go and look at the original after you listen to this. The Mask by Maya Angelou. We wear the mask that grins and lies. It shades our cheeks and hides our eyes. This debt we pay to human guile, with torn and bleeding hearts, we smile. And mouth the myriad subtleties, why should the world think otherwise? In counting all our tears and sighs, nay, let them only see us while we wear the mask. We smile. But oh my God, our tears to thee from tortured souls arise. And we sing. Yes, baby, we sing. The clay is vile beneath our feet, and long the mile, but let the world think otherwise. We wear the mask. When I think about myself, I almost laugh myself to death. My life has been one great big joke, a dance that's walked, a song that's spoke. I laugh so hard, I almost choke when I think about myself. 70 years in these folks' world. The child I work for calls me girl. I say, yes, ma'am, for working's sake. I'm too proud to bend and too poor to break. So I laugh until my stomach ache when I think about myself. My folks can make me split my side. I laugh so hard I nearly died. The tales they tell sound just like lying. They grow the fruit, but eat the rind. I laugh until I start to cry when I think about myself and my folks and the children. My fathers sit on benches. Their flesh count every plank. The slats leave dents of darkness deep in their withered flank. And they're gnarled like broken candles, all waxed and burnt profound. They say, but sugar, it was our submission that made your world go round. There in those pleated faces, I see the auction block, the chains and slavery's coffles, the whip and lash and stock. My fathers speak in voices that shred my fact and sound. They say, but sugar, it was our submission that made your world go round. They laugh to conceal their crying. They shuffle through their dreams. They stepped and fetched a country and wrote the blues and screams. I understand their meaning. It could and did derive from living on the edge of death. They kept my race alive by wearing the mask. That's it for me this week. If you made it this far, I really want to thank you again for listening. If you liked me reading that poem, I would really encourage you to go and listen to the original because Maya Angelou is shockingly much better at this than I am, and I really think it's one of the best spoken word poems of all time. I want to give another huge shout out to Saz Jazz Paris. He's got 2 albums of covers out on Spotify and Apple Music now. I definitely encourage you all to go and check those out. And finally, if you like what you heard today, please subscribe, follow, give us 5 stars or a thumbs up or whatever arbitrary thing means I like this on the platform that you're listening to it on. I'm your host, Andrew, and you've been listening to the Bad Eye Podcast. I will catch up with you next week with a different topic. Be easy, y'all.